Hey patrons, welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial series. In part 1 we were working on the background of this deer painting. We were painting in all of the flowers and we added salt to create a really cool effect, which you can already kind of see how it dried. It created a really stunning effect. And now in this part we're going to be focusing on painting the deer. So I'm making you close up from a side angle so that you can really see how I'm going to paint the face of the deer. And I'm starting off with just some black paint, and I'm going to start to paint in the darkest parts of the deer, which are the eyes and the nose. As you can see in the reference, they are the darkest parts. Also, there's quite a deep shadow on the left ear. So I'm just going to be carefully using my very detailed round brush from the Silver Black Velvet paintbrush collection. And I'm just using that to carefully paint in this eye, being very careful. I didn't mix in much water at all with my paint, just enough to get it to move freely on the paper. But I want this colour to be very dark and opaque, so I made sure that I didn't mix in too much water, otherwise it got a bit diluted. I'm also adding a few little first strokes just above the eye, as there is a little bit of shadow just above the eye and a tiny bit below. And then I'm just going to repeat the same process on this other eye now. As you can see, all of the features are sketched in, which makes it a lot easier to just go in and fill this in with paint. I'm also trying to preserve tiny highlights that you can see within each eye. The highlight is a lot brighter on this left-hand side eye, on the left eye. I did the same thing by creating a few little first strokes above the left eye as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and just fill in the nose area. There are a couple of highlights within the nose, and also the lower part where the mouth is, that is white fur, so we're not going to be adding black paint to that area. But I'm just starting off by outlining each section that I need to fill in. Just getting a really nice clean edge for the outlines and just trying to kind of sketch everything in, so I've got all of the different structures of the nose painted in, basically just going over the outlines. Then I'm just filling in this side bit, because that is very dark. I'm making sure to keep looking at the reference image whilst I'm painting this. So now I've blocked in the darkest areas. I've added more water to my black paint so that I can fill in the slightly lighter areas and the shadows for that white fur. So you can see that I've left those two highlighted areas within the nose at the bottom, as we can see that there are a couple of little areas which are also just white fur. And I'm taking that diluted black and I'm going to start to fill in the shadows that you can see on the right hand side of the deer's face. You can see that the right hand side has got more shadow on it. The light is coming in from the left hand side. I will be overlaying some browns as well on top of this, but I just wanted to loosely paint in where the shadows are on the right hand side of the face. Once again, I have got all of these main shadows sketched out, so I'm just following my sketch. Adding the shadow that's on the top of the head. Adding a bit more water. The more water you add to the paint, the lighter the colour is going to be. I'm also going to start to add some of the shadows for the side of the nose, and also by the left eye. The shadow is a little bit lighter on the left hand side, so that's why I'm using the diluted paint, adding even more water because it's a very subtle shadow. Now I'm going in with a darker brown, and I'm going to use this brown and just tap it in over those shadows. Because the paint is still wet, you can see that when I tap in the brown, it bleeds out with that light grey paint, with that diluted black, to create a really nice soft effect. And I'm doing the same thing but with more of a diluted brown on the left hand side. I'm now going back in with that brown, and I'm going to start to paint in some of the shadows for the ear, starting with the right ear. Most of the shadows are within the center of the ear and also around the outer edge. So I'm just painting in where I can see all of the darkest shadows, not worrying too much about all of the details. I want to keep this quite expressive, so I'm just blocking in the main shadows. Just basically want to get down the general idea of the shadows in the ear and outline it. So I want to darken this up, so I'm taking some black. I just want to tap that over the darkest shadows just to darken them up a bit more. And I'm going to take that paint and just use it to outline the ear. Going back over the shadows in the middle of the ear. I'm also going to tap a little more of that into the shadows on the face of the deer. Mixing up some darker brown. And just tapping that darker brown particularly over on the right hand side of the deer's face and on the top of the head as well. Just above the nose. And I'm going to sweep that shadow around under the right eye. I'm going to add a little more detail to the right ear. Just adding a few little fur strokes just to give the impression of a furry texture. Just adding a layer of brown over the nose. I'm now going to start to work on the left ear. I'm starting off with a more diluted dark brown, so I just added a tiny bit of water to the paint. And I'm going to repeat the same process of adding the main shadows for the ear, which again are in the center of the ear, and it's creating like a sideways Y shape or a V. So I created that sideways UV shape, and I'm also outlining the ear because there is a shadow, a very dark shadow around the outer edge of the ear. So a darker outline around the ear, so I just wanted to add that in. And again, I'm adding a few little lines to give the look of a furry texture. I'm looking at the direction the fur is going in when I'm doing this, so I know how I should curve my lines, which direction they should go in, and all of that. So I'm just going to finish off working on the ear, adding a little more shadow to the outer edge of the ear. But really I don't want to work and add too much detail. I still want this to be very loose and expressive. Now I'm going to go back to the deer's face, just tap in a few more shadows in a few of the darkest areas of the face. You can see I'm adding a few little fur details to the top of the head, adding a few little lines. And also darkening up where the mouth is. Now I'm going to layer a lighter brown, more of a golden light brown, very similar to the colour we use for part of the background. And I'm just going to add this to those lighter areas, and you can see in the reference there are parts of the face and the body that have got more of that saturated golden tone. So I'm using this colour to make those areas pop and look a little more vibrant. For example, right to the left hand side of the nose. Also tapping it more on the left hand side and over the ears a bit. I'm just tapping a little bit by the side of the ear as well. Adding some more to the left of the nose. Under the left eye. And just at the bottom of the ears as well. So I just mixed up more of a warm brown, and I'm just tapping that in a couple of areas as well. And now I'm going to start to work on the body of the deer. So I'm adding a very light wash of that brown, first working on the neck of the deer. And I'm going to start to add in the saturated colours. And this will help to wet the base of the neck. So it will help us to get a nice wet base so that we can tap in the darker shadows in a minute as well. As you can see, I do like to work from light to dark. Now I'm mixing up some darker brown, and I'm going to tap that where the shadows on the neck are, which is mostly again on the right hand side of the neck. So I'm first layering it there, looking at the direction the fur is going in, so that if I do any lines, I make sure that they're going with the direction of the fur, which is pretty much vertically. Going in with some darker brown again. I want to darken it up even more. And I'm also just cleaning up the edge of the neck as well. So now I'm going to go in with some darker brown, and you can see that I keep building up the intensity and getting darker and darker. And I just want to focus on adding this dark brown to the darkest areas. You want to try and preserve the highlights for other areas because it's hard to lighten them back up if you notice that you've gone a bit too dark. So always try to preserve the highlighted areas of the deer, like the left hand side of the neck, because it is going to be hard if you realise that you've gone a bit too dark in that area to actually go and lighten it back up. So now I'm just tapping some more saturated golden brown tone. So like an orangey colour. Just tapping that onto the saturated areas of the neck and also the ears of the deer. And adding a couple of splatters around as well. So I didn't just want the deer to look brown and dull. I do want to add in these bright golden tones and orangey tones to make it look a little more vibrant. Now I'm going to move on to working on the body of the deer. So I'm mixing up this light tone and I'm going to spread that all around the body because again we want to wet the surface, so we just want to add a light wash of colour so that we can tap in our darker tones. I want to leave the little bit of the back of the deer. You can see that there's a bit of a highlight, so I'm going around that area and trying to avoid adding any paint to that area so that that white of the paper is preserved for that highlight. But I'm adding a very, very diluted form of this yellowy brown, very light golden brown tone all over the body of the deer, just to add a very nice base. And now I'm going to go in with the darker browns and tap them in where you can see the shadows. And because this wash is very light, you'll probably still be able to see your sketch outline showing through, and you'll be able to see where you've sketched out where the shadows are supposed to be, so you can just follow that sketch. And because this whole surface is wet, you'll see that the colours will nicely bleed out. You won't get any harsh edges. So the whole of the body is quite dark. There's a little bit of highlight right at the top of the deer's body, but especially the lower part where it's going into those flowers and where the wheat and the flowers are starting to cover the deer, it is quite dark there. So I'm just going to build up to darker intensities of the brown. And I'm tapping this darker brown over where the darkest parts of the deer are. Keep checking your reference image as well. So I'm bringing that shadow further down. Now I'm mixing up some dark brown and some Payne's grey. And I'm tapping this where those stems, those green stems of the flowers are layering over the top of the deer. And I'm also adding this to all of the darkest shadows of the deer's body as well. Mainly at the bottom though. And I'm mixing in more brown when I'm adding the shadows higher up. So you can see that I'm tapping in the shadows towards the top, but I'm leaving a little strip between that shadow and the top of the body because there is that thin highlight where the light is hitting the top of the deer's body. Just going in with that darker brown again, just building up the shadows. So because I want this to be a loose and expressive watercolour painting with lots of cool effects, I'm going to go in and I'm going to get just clean water on my brush and I'm going to splatter that onto the body of the deer, as you can see. And adding clean water into more opaque and more pigmented paint means that you get this really cool starry effect wherever you tap in the water. So you can already see that it's creating this really interesting effect where I've added water into the darker areas of paint. So that is a quick way that you can make your watercolour paintings look a little more interesting and not just a flat wash of colour. Now it has a little more of an interesting look to those shadows. Now I'm just observing the reference and thinking about what I want to do next. So I'm just lifting a little bit of watercolour paint from the neck just to preserve the highlights. And just adding a little more of that saturated golden tone to the neck, creating a little more fur detail. And adding a little more to the face of the deer as well, just to make that a little more vibrant, just like the body is. Adding a few shadows to the neck as well. And I'm adding a little more shadow once again to the body of the deer. It's really important that you get the shadows as dark as they need to be, and bear in mind that with watercolours, when the watercolours dry, they do dry lighter than they look when they're wet. So even though the shadows may look really dark when they are wet, remember that they will dry a little lighter. So I'm just going to continue to build up the shadows. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start to add a few splatters around the ear. So I'm adding some more intense browns to the right ear. And I'm going to use some water to help blend that further into the background. And I'm also going to take a bit more of that opaque golden tone and add a few splatters over the top of that right ear as well. I just wanted to make it look like the colours from the ear are bleeding out into the background. Also just adding a few splatters with the pink paint onto the background as well. And I'm splattering a little bit of that pink onto the deer as well, as some of the pink flowers are overlapping onto that part of the deer. Once again, I'm lifting up some of the paint from the neck of the deer. And you can use the tissue to remove any paint that you aren't happy with. If you've made a mistake, as long as the watercolour is still wet, then you can use the tissue to lift up that paint, or you can use the tissue to create some really cool effects. So I'm going to use the tissue now to create some of these little bits of tall grass and wheat that is going over onto the deer. So I'm going to use that tissue to help create those. So I'm making the tissue into a very thin side, so I can just go and dab away in a nice line. And you can also use a brush to do this. So use a clean damp brush and keep cleaning it and dampening it, or keep wetting it and cleaning it between each time you go and do it. For example, I've just gone there and picked up some paint on my brush, so I now need to clean it off again before I go back in and remove some more paint. And the more times you do it, the more it's going to lighten up and remove more of the paint. But it's really important that you do go and clean the brush after each sweep that you do. So I'm just going to continue to do this process for a few more tall bits of grass. So now I'm just tapping in a bit more of that clean water to create some more of those cool starry effects. And I'm basically going to be building up more shadows now and added more saturation and vibrancy to the body of the deer. So you can see that I'm using more of those red tone browns. So I'm focusing on making sure that I've got all of the shadows blocked in that I need to. I also want to darken up the darkest shadows a little bit more. And I'm also going to create more of a definitive clean outline around the face and part of the body of the deer as well. So I'm going to outline it a little bit just to make it more defined. So I'm just going to be using the same colours and just darkening up those shadowed areas, adding more yellow golden tones as well, especially over those highlighted areas that we've just created with the water. So I want to make them more of a golden tone. So that is what I'm going to be doing for the next 5 minutes, and then I'll be back to talk you through the next part. So like I said, I'm just finishing off by adding some shadows to the head of the deer, and you can see that I've outlined the ears a bit more, and I'm going to outline under the mouth, under the chin part of the deer. And I'm also going to go in and add a few very thin lines just to define the edges of the head of the deer on the right hand side first. And then I'll also do the same thing just on the left hand side. Only very subtly. I don't want there to be really big thick lines and outlines. Just to give it more of a defined edge so it doesn't get lost. I'm just doing it with the top of the neck as well. But it's up to you whether you want to do this. But that is it for this part. So we have worked on the deer in this part, and it's pretty much how it's going to be at the end of the painting. So what we're going to be doing in part 3 is we are going to be adding in all of the details for the plants, for the background. We're going to be going in and painting in the flowers and the stems, and also using gouache to add the highlights. And we're just going to be finishing this off. So I'll see you guys in the next and final part of the series. Bye everybody.